All right. So, welcome everyone to our lecture this week for Race, Crime, and Justice. We are in week 6, and this week we are looking at race, prosecution, and punishment. And so, um, yeah, we're just going to dive into it. So, a brief recap. This is a recap for anyone who has taken intercriminal justice or anything of that nature. If you've not taken it, let this be a chance for you to learn a little bit something about the criminal justice system. And the text even opens with this. But when someone is arrested and charged with a crime, there's a process that begins, and the process itself has several different, we call them actors, but several different people and components within the system that operate together. And so, as we discussed the previous week, where we went through, all the different stages of the criminal justice system, much like that, there's multiple people. And so, just real quickly, we need to have a general understanding what defendant, prosecutor, and judge is about, because, well, that's kind of the focus of this week. So, real quick, a prosecutor is the individual who is representing the state or the municipality or the federal government. This is the lawyer that is trying to get a person to be sent to jail. The prosecution is the prosecutor, the prosecution is the interests of the government. A judge is the person who oversees the actions and performances within the courtroom. Um, there are different things between a bench trial and a jury trial. A jury trial is a jury. Bench is just a judge decision. Doesn't make any relevant data to you if you're not into the criminal justice system. But what's important to know is that judge's main role is to make sure that everyone's following the correct rules and everything's going fairly within a trial itself. And then the defendant, I put in parentheses there, accused. The defendant is the person who is getting charged with the crime. And that's the easiest way to remember it, is they're the defense. They are defending the claim that is not true or true. So, these are the three main people that we're going to look at. And really, some of these decisions that are made, I marked here for you. Prosecutors decide what to charge and whether or not they're going to charge. So, technically speaking, the prosecution can decide not to charge someone with a criminal offense, and they just release them. So that is a possibility. If they do decide to charge someone, they decide what they're going to try and charge them with. So what are we saying that they actually committed crime wise? And then prosecutors also get to ask judges to hold these individuals, these defendants, in prison before, or rather in jail, before they have their trial. And if not, they would be released on bail or things like that. So that means judges get to decide whether or not to detain a person or release them on bail, which bail is just a financial amount of money that an individual pays that is a guarantee that they will appear in court when they're supposed to. Um, they also decide whether or not to pursue a trial. If the evidence presented by the prosecution is not sufficient enough that a jury would find them guilty, a judge can deny a trial, or they can send it to trial. Um, in the court itself, they make rulings on the charges and they make rulings on sentences. So, in a excuse me, in a bench trial where there's not a jury and it's just the judge, they would make the absolute call on a charge or a sentence. But in a jury trial, the they make determinations based off of what the jury decides. So the jury can say that they find the defendant guilty or innocent, and the judge just simply enacts the official claim of the jury. And then the defendant, their main role in all of this is to claim their guilt or their innocence. So how do you plead guilty, not guilty? When you're in a court, the defense, it's not it's the burden of proof for the prosecution, not the defense. Anyway, these are just important things to know to understand the context of what we're going to be talking about. And so another thing that is to be mentioned is that we talked about it briefly when we talked about policing. There is a large section of discretion that's allowed for police officers, but within the justice system in the courts, judges, there's discretion that prosecutors and judges can use, but it's more discretion is allowed for minor offenses, whereas major offenses have pretty straightforward and clear guidelines. Like, you cannot do certain things. So, I have to include this joke, and this is related in particular to conviction, but your chances of getting killed by a cow are low, but never zero. I wanted to throw in something at least to make you chuckle. So, real quickly, we need to talk about these 4 particular areas. So we talked about there's a prosecutor, a judge, and defendant, but we need to talk about the sections of this process. So we have the prosecution itself, which is during the court. We have conviction, we have sentencing, and we have parole. So, prosecution. Data is fairly limited, but it does focus on some key areas. The key areas and decisions that they look at in particular can be found on page 121. It's the research that does exist explores prosecutors' decisions regarding whether to have pretrial defendants detained in jail instead of releasing them on their own recognizance, whether to drop all charges against a defendant, whether to bring more serious or less serious charges against defendants whose cases are not dropped, and whether to settle on more or less serious charges during plea bargaining. And that's an important piece that we need to talk about in particular here. Plea bargaining, because it is a common misconception because of the abundance of crime shows, legal shows, all this stuff. Most cases in the real world don't go to court. They are settled with plea bargains. So that is an important note. Most cases are resolved via a plea bargain, not going to trial. But with this inconsistent data and the varied amount of research for prosecution, one thing important to note is that overall minority defendants may be at a disadvantage. And some of these factors that make them be a possible disadvantage are finances, past criminal history, geographic location, education, the typical things that we've seen across the board throughout this class of things that don't quite line up right. So then we talk about conviction. So much like I said, most cases are resolved with plea bargaining, not a trial. When they do go to trial, and this is where the cow meme comes in, the impact of bias that they find through this research on jury members is minimal. It's little, but not zero. So the chances of there being a racial bias on a jury is low, but it's never zero. And that kind of plays into a sad reality about human beings as individuals. It's not necessarily racial bias, but all humans have some type of bias that they have that's innate and part of them. It's how you're raised. It's who you are. You can't avoid it. Everyone has some type of bias. There is a song from a show from the mid-2000s, Broadway show called Avenue Q. The song is Everybody's a Little Bit Racist. It's a very offensive song, and the musical itself is very offensive at times as well, but they bring up that point that everybody has biases, and that is a fact. You can't say that you don't have a bias I guarantee if you dig hard enough, you're going to find some group, some belief that is a bias against something. So there is a chance that a jury member's bias will affect your conviction and sentencing, but it's not really high. It's not like, oh, you're going to have all this stuff. But there are three key findings from the research on conviction that is very important, and the text brings up, and partly why I wanted to focus on this is that the three findings, are that number one, jurors are somewhat more likely to acquit defendants of their same race. So if you are white and sitting on a jury, the data says that you are more likely to acquit or say that they are not charged with that crime if if the defendant themselves is also white. Same could be going for if you're African American and you are on a jury and there is an African American as the defendant, you are statistically more likely to side with them to be acquitted than to charge guilt. That's not to say it's 100%, but that's the general finding is statistically speaking, jurors are more likely to acquit defendants of their same race as they are. The second thing is that racial bias appears more likely in less serious crimes. And this goes back to the previous point that I said about discretion for minor offenses. What we tend to see in the data is that when the sentence is, or the, not the sentence, the crime itself is more serious, like murder, things of that nature, racial bias has very little to do with it. It tends to be murder, bad. It doesn't have a wiggle room on there. White murderers don't get away easier than African American murderers. There's deeper issues with that, but the point is that typically the less serious the crime, like drug offenses, that's where we see those racial biases appear more often. And that we have the data showing specifically drug arrest is the big one. We're going to talk about one of those here in a little bit. But we see disproportionately more convictions of people of color for drug offenses than we see white, even though the data says that they're not really more likely to do it. It's just that they are disproportionately higher convicted of it. And then the third finding from this research on conviction in particular is that all white juries are more likely to convict African American defendants. And yeah, there's something to be said about group behavior dynamics and things of that nature, but typically all white juries are, according to the data, the more likely to convict an African American defendant. So, regarding sentencing, again, data is sparse and not as full as we would like, but the general results of the data and the research shows trends. And so it's important to know what a trend is when we talk about data and research. Trends they're like patterns. We see that they tend to be going towards a certain direction. It's not a guarantee. Trend does not mean that it is 100% going to happen, but we see that according to the data, according to history, it looks like it is probably going to go in that particular direction. So, through the data we found with sentencing, we see some trends emerge, and that's African American, Latinx, and Native Americans are somewhat more likely to be sentenced to prison instead of probation or fines. So, typically speaking, what we see trend-wise is that white individuals are less likely to be sentenced to prison instead of probation or fines. Like, they're given that option of probation or fines before they are sentenced to prison, where we see that African Americans, Latinx, and Native Americans are more likely to be sentenced. And that's the trend. We see that those numbers are higher for that group than another group. Another is that there are longer sentences for people of color. A big issue with this one in particular is that there are not a lot of studies that have data about this. The book even mentions that the longer sentences for people of color is an inconsistent data point. There are studies that show that yes, the much like the pay gap between men and women exists very well. They see that in some studies that there are prison sentences for two individuals of the exact same crime and everything, but a person of color has a longer sentence than a white person does. However, across the board research data doesn't support that, so it's difficult to prove. It's not statistically significant enough to say that it is a for sure thing. But that's why it's an important note to say that this trend, we seem to see longer sentences for people of color. And of course, this goes back to something we talked about early in this class, but it's unfortunately something we have to bring up again. Another trend in sentencing that we see is that African American and Latinx young males have more disadvantages in this area of sentencing. These are the individuals who are getting sent to prison, to juvenile detention, where we see that young African American males and young Latinx males are more involved in the criminal justice system, not on the working end from an employee, but as a defendant. And that goes into trends and data that we've talked about earlier in this class, where they are disproportionately higher represented in the data. And so it's important to bring that up and remind us about it. Overall, the decision to incarcerate, and this is something else that we kind of find, is that the decision to incarcerate is impacted more than the sentence length and severity. So what we see in general in this sentencing from all this data is that the length and severity of a punishment is not directly connected to racial biases as we see it. It's there, but it's not the norm. However, the actual conviction to sentencing, that seems to have an actual connection to these sorts of biases. Lesser offenses, again, are the ones that tend to get sentenced more than serious crimes. Not that serious crimes don't get sentenced, but we see more of that disproportion of racial bias and treatment in lesser offenses. And then the other thing that we find is that harsher sentences when the victim is white. And again, this goes back to things that we've talked about already in this class. There is this issue. So one other thing that comes from this kind of data and is important to note, and we talked about it before, and that's the idea of passing. Again, this is a historically very dangerous area, but the idea of passing is that you look white European enough that you are not thought to be of any different background. So what we find is that skin color and Afrocentric facial features have an impact on sentencing. So again, with the skin tone, darker skinned white males will be treated as if they are Latinx or African American, even if they are white. So there is an issue with that. And there's also the idea that we have unintentionally identified what are considered Afrocentric facial features. And the text even talks about it, nose shape, lips, things like that. It leads to people making judgments and decisions that have no basis in reality. And so that's why it's important to note that unfortunately, sentencing is impacted by skin color and facial features. And yeah. So parole is the easiest one to talk about here in the textbook and in this lecture because there's not enough data. Just plain and simple, there is not enough data on this particular section within with racial bias involved. What we see across the board is that typically within the field of corrections, once an individual is in the system, if they're going up for parole and they're going to a parole board, the parole board doesn't seem to make judgments based off of racial biases. They're based off of behavior, past behavior, and things of that nature. So that's why the data is not clear. Not to say that there isn't possible or there isn't a possibility of racial bias in parole sentencing and hearing or parole hearings, but there's not enough data to say. So now I want to kind of go back a little bit because after conviction, the text talks about wrongful conviction. I wanted to save it for its own section because it's something that needs its own little conversation, and that's also because that's kind of the focus of this week in our discussion board at least. So with the understanding and data that conviction, we do see a higher rate of conviction for African Americans and Latinx individuals. We do see that there is some level of racial bias for conviction and sentencing. It's important to understand that there are wrongful convictions. And according to the data from the textbook, it's estimated between 5,000 and 30,000 wrongful felony convictions happen annually. And really, hear me say that again. Between 5,000 and 30,000 wrongful felony convictions annually. That means that there are so many people who are being wrongly arrested, wrongly charged, wrongly put into custody. And that's a serious issue. And disproportionately, we see that a lot of it is African Americans. So, real quick, the percentage data from the text, page 124, and at the bottom and the top of 125. Although African Americans comprise 38% of state prison inmates sentenced for homicide, they account for 50% of homicide exonerations. Although they comprise 23% of state inmates sentenced for sexual assault, they account for 59% of sexual assault exonerations. Although they comprise 33% of state inmates sentenced for drug offenses, they account for 55% of drug offense exonerations. Innocent African Americans are more likely than innocent whites to be convicted of these crimes. This type of research points to a strong role of racial bias in wrongful convictions. And that's the piece here about wrongful convictions. If we look at the data, 38% of state prison inmates for homicide, but 50% of the exonerations for homicide. So 38%, half of that is what? I'm bad at math. 19%? 19% of homicides, the killer was still out there, and they convicted the wrong person for it. That's not okay. That is that is not statistically high enough to be like a serious claim of 19% error, but it's still bad. It's not good. And I guess that's what I'm trying to get at with wrongful convictions. And again, we're the focus of the discussion board is on more of this. There are things like the Innocence Project that strive to push back against these wrongful convictions and release individuals who were imprisoned under, well, false information, false data, all these types of things. It's not kind of, it is, it's a big issue. Um, like I said, the focus of the discussion board is going to ask you to look at some websites about wrongful conviction and things of that nature. And I ask you to consider that and think about it carefully as we go forward. That two things to remember. Number one, people who are incarcerated, not all of them are there for committing a serious crime. Some of them are not even there for committing a crime. And that's an important distinction. Not everybody is a murderer. And you kind of have to find a way to see that. And that's what all these programs are about, is seeing that sometimes the justice system gets it very wrong. How do we fix it? So, we need to talk about cumulative disadvantage. In the criminal justice system, cumulative disadvantage is that it's not one outwardly racist thing in the world, it's many tiny things in the system. So, it's not that, oh, one person or the criminal justice system, period, is racist. No. There are several spots within the criminal justice system and within the larger system itself that, when combined together, make a cumulative disadvantage for people of color within the criminal justice system. And we're going to look at a couple of them. And these are the ones that the book puts forward. And honestly, two of them are exactly the same thing that I would have picked if the text didn't say it. So, worked out perfectly. So, let's talk about the legal war on drugs first. And so you notice I put legal in quotations because it was mandated by law. Everything was put together to say that, to combat illegal drug use, we're going to have our war on drugs, where we are going to arrest individuals. We're going to be tough on drug crime. And hindsight is 2020, and our hindsight look at the legal war on drugs. It has been known as the new Jim Crow era of type of laws because it disproportionately focused on people of color. We talked about that before. We brought it back. I brought it up, I think, in actually chapter 1 in the first week. But the idea that we're going to make drugs that are primarily used by African Americans illegal, but not crack down on the version that the white people use, is a clear sign that there was a racial bias behind this. But because of the war on drugs, we saw higher rates of incarceration despite the evidence that we saw previously. We've talked about that there was no significance of greater drug use within communities of color. Like, the fact of the matter is, when we look at the data across the board, race and ethnicity have nothing to do with drug crimes. White, African American, Asian American, Pacific Islander, Canadian, Mexican American, Latinx, doesn't matter. You all have the same possibility of getting into drugs. It comes down to geographic location, school, community, that kind of stuff, which disproportionately shows higher for people of color than white. And so those higher rates of incarceration, despite the data saying there's no significant reason for greater appearance for these drugs, like that shows that there is clearly a design that's pointing towards this. Also, related to this, it's important to note that the target areas for drug busting tend to be very urban areas. Drugs are high in the urban areas, so we focus on them. But the urban areas are not necessarily that they're higher crime, but you police them more often. If you told me that there aren't drugs in the suburbs, I'm going to laugh at you and say, oh no, there are. I may not have grown up in the suburbs, but I had friends who did. And in high school, some of their neighbors and whatnot were into hard drugs. Like, it's not only in the city, it's not only in the urban area. No, it is everywhere. And that's an issue. But notice there's a sub piece on this legal war on drugs. The opioid crisis, if you have been paying attention to general like news information and stuff over the past 10 years in particular, you might have heard this, the opioid crisis said. And words matter. I just said this in a different lecture for intro to corrections, but it's true. Your word choice matters. The war on drugs versus the opioid crisis. How do those names change how we look at it? The war on drugs, well, drugs are the bad, the evil, terrible thing, and we have to destroy it through war. The opioid crisis, it's a crisis, it's a problem, we need to solve it, we need to fix it. War is destroy, crisis is fix. And so the opioid crisis is been referred to as an epidemic and a public health crisis. Epidemic. We treat it as a disease, but we don't treat other drug addiction as a disease, at least not publicly as a huge collective. Some individuals may side with that way of thinking, and yeah. The opioid crisis, in particular, the data is that 90% of the deaths from the opioid crisis are of whites. About 8% are African American. 90% of the deaths are white, and we call it an opioid crisis. We have a disproportionately high number of African Americans and Latinx individuals in prison for drug offenses during the war on drugs. There's some issues here. As I said before, words matter, and we could spend a lot of time diving in on some deeper issues of the war on drugs and the opioid crisis. But what our author is trying to point out and what I'm trying to emphasize here is that when we talk about cumulative disadvantage, when we talk about the little things that add up, if we look at an example of the legal war on drugs versus the opioid crisis, both things are very strictly understood as a drug problem, period. Both are a drug problem. It's how we addressed it. When it had to do with a group of people who are of color, we got harsh on it, but when it was an issue of predominantly white, we didn't punish those people for using the drug. We felt so terrible about all those deaths that we tried to ban the drug. Not arrest the drug user for it too. No, it was get that help. So, another area that this is seen in is harsher punishment when we talk about capital punishment. This is not the one I would have picked, but it's a good example. I would have picked the war on drugs and juvenile justice. Anyway, capital punishment. We see that there are harsher punishments when the offender is a person of color and when the victim is white. We've talked about this before. But, in particular, the text brings up a California study from 2005 that when the death penalty for capital offenses came up, if the victim was white, they were 3.7 times more likely to call for the death penalty than if it was an African American victim, and 4.7 times more likely if the victim was Latinx. So what we see is that in California in 2000, well, before pre-2005, because that's when the study came out, that in cases of a capital offense of murder, if the victim was white, they had a higher chance of being convicted of the death penalty than if the victim was African American or Latinx. Now, the data does not tell us the race of the individual who is being charged, but what we do see is that there seems to be an implicit ranking of life, that the life of a person of color, not colored person, that was definitely wrong, that the life of a person of color is somehow less than white, and that's not okay. And that's what this data is showing us. But now to get to the other example that I wanted to talk about was juvenile justice. So we've already talked about it before. I feel like I'm repeating myself a lot, but hey, that's the nature of this. We see that young men, especially African American boys, I'm going to even say boys, not men, young African American boys and young Latinx boys are disproportionately represented in the juvenile justice system. They are being sentenced more often. They are being more engaged in the system. They are being arrested, sometimes targeted. We see that youth of color are more likely to be detained by police, referred to juvenile courts, and be sent to residential facilities more often than white youth. Part of this, and it's important to note, is that there is a wide amount of data. It's a variable data, so it's not that there's a one-to-one for sure, but what does come out is that it suggests that there is an impact, particularly in DMC, disproportionate minority contact. DMC comes up later. It's why I emphasize this. Disproportionate minority contact is overrepresentation of youth of color in the juvenile justice system. The idea here is that there is a higher chance that a youth of color is going to be somehow involved in the juvenile justice system more likely than a white juvenile is going to be. And that's based just on the data and that kind of results. Takeaway from this? I don't know. That's being honest. I don't know. The takeaway. The takeaway from this discussion is that not everyone who is sentenced to prison or juvenile detention is guilty of their crime. And we have data that shows that there is an imbalance, that we do see racial biases play a role in the sentencing of individuals, not necessarily how long they're sentenced, but the fact that they are sentenced and the fact that they are being convicted of crimes. We see a higher percentage. I want to end on really, there's a really good quote um, here in the end of the chapter, and I just wanted to read it because I think it's important to go through this. So it's the very end of 133. Scholars continue to debate which of these two dynamics, differential involvement in crime versus discriminatory practices in criminal justice, contribute more to differential involvement in criminal justice. For now, the best conclusion is that both dynamics seem to matter. So, short recap, uh, the differences in the type of involvement that happens based solely on factors like where they are and things like that, or discriminatory practices, aka rules that are written to be a little bit unfair. We don't have a definitive answer of one or the other. We're just kind of like they seem to both matter. So, as criminologist Cassius Spohn observes, it seems reasonable to conclude that the racial disproportionality in the prison population results to a large extent from racial disparities in criminal involvement, but to some extent from racial discrimination at various stages in the criminal justice process, including sentencing. Persuasive evidence exists that racial minorities are subject to racial profiling and they are more likely than whites to be shot and killed, arrested, and victimized by excessive physical force. Compelling evidence also points to racial bias in decisions regarding bail, charging, plea bargaining, jury selection, sentencing, and juvenile justice processing. And a sentencing expert, Mark Maurer, agrees. While the racial disparities produced by the criminal justice system have complex origins and are far less likely to appear as outwardly racist as in the days of Jim Crow, they nonetheless are pervasive at each stage of the system. However, unintended this pattern of bias and discrimination might usually be, it does great harm to people of color and is simply unacceptable in a nation that aspires to liberty and justice for all. Saying that it doesn't exist, ignoring that there is not some deep issues, is burying your head in the sand. One of the main points of this class is not to make you feel guilty for being white or make you see things differently. The point of this class is to have an open discussion about the issue of race within the criminal justice system and how complicated and complex it is. And to see that when people say the criminal justice system is racist or corrupt, it's a yes and a no answer. Yes, there's bad actors and there's things that cause it to be not great, but it's not that the whole thing itself is outwardly racist or meaning to be. It's the little things that add up that destroy lives, and that's the reality. They destroy lives. And so it's important to have these conversations and know that there are more perspectives. Perhaps one of the most important things I can say in relation not just to this class, but life in general, and this is just good life advice. There are two sides to every coin. There are two sides to every story. Actually, there's more than two sides to every story, but the point is always be open to listening to the other side. If you don't, you're not going to solve anything. That's the point of this class. All right, on that less than stellar happy but rather hopefully a promising for the future uplifting moment, So, as I stated in in the discussion board, in the intro video, and I discussed briefly before, the discussion board this week is looking at wrongful convictions, cumulative disadvantages, and in particular, disproportionate minority contact. I'm having you explore the outside readings, and I put that in air quotes because I want you to look at wrongful convictions in particular. So just think about that. Feel free to uh, pull a wrongful conviction case that you know about or care about, or as you're reading, you find one you really like. Choose that, dig into that, and yeah, hopefully. So, I guess last thing to wrap up before we go. Next week is the last chapter of the textbook, which is all about where do we go from here, the future of this. And that's kind of hopefully the bright light at the end of the tunnel for all of us. So, yeah, thanks for sticking around and talk to you soon.